This is question number 15 of homework 13 for chapter 9. Agris Bank holds no excess reserves but complies with the reserve requirement. The required reserves ratio is 9% and reserves are currently $27 million. The amount of deposits is how much? Round usually responds to one decimal place. So in this case, we are told that this bank doesn't have any excess reserves but complies with the reserve requirement. So that means the amount of reserves, $27 million, is simply the amount of deposits times the required reserve ratio. Also, from that, we can solve out the amount of deposits. So the required reserve ratio is 10%, and no, it's 9% actually, and the reserves is $27 million. So I'm just write 27 because the answer here is also in million dollars. So we're asked about amount of deposits, and we know that deposit times it's deposit times reserve ratio equals reserves. Hence, deposit equals reserves divided by reserve ratio. So that can help us to solve out this problem, which is reserves divided by reserve ratio. So that gives us 300, and it's a precise number. So even though it's we need to round to one decimal place, but that doesn't change this amount. So we can just write down $300 million. Check answer. Nice work. So continue. The reserve shortage created by a deposit outflow of $5 million is. Here, rounding requirement is round your response to 2 decimal places. So the deposit outflow means that the depositors take out $5 million from the 300 million deposits of the bank. So that means the remaining deposit is simply the initial deposit minus $5 million, so 295. And based on this remaining deposit, we can get the remaining required reserve. So that is remaining deposit times the reserve ratio, 26.55. And the question is asking about the reserve shortage created by the deposit. Because when the depositors take out the deposits from the bank has to use its portion of its existing reserves to pay the depositors. Hence, the reserves, the $27 million of reserves, will also decrease by $5 million. So the remaining reserves is simply this 27 minus 5. So now we see there's a shortage because what's required is this 26.555, and what's remaining is only 22. So the shortage is simply here, I guess, as it turns out, even though it's not directly asking about this, but as it turns out, MATLAB is asking for you can input a negative number if to represent a shortage. So in that case, it's the remaining reserves minus the remaining required reserves. So that gives us negative 4.55. Negative 4.55. 4.55. So the absolute number is $4.55 million in the reserve shortage. The final part, the cost of the reserve shortage if Angus Bank borrows in the federal funds market, assume the federal funds rate is 0.25% is. So in class, we talk about 4 ways that a bank can fund its shortage in reserves. It can either borrow from the federal funds market, or if you take out my lecture slides here, you can see the shortfall in reserves. And the 4 ways to make up the shortfalls: borrow from the other firms, which means it borrows from the federal funds market. And the second way is borrowing from the Federal Reserve through the discount window. And third way is by selling some of its holdings of securities. For example, the treasury bills or treasury bonds. That's some of the securities a commercial bank can hold. And that can also generate some money for the bank, which can meet the reserve shortage. And the final way to meet the shortage is simply to call in some of the loans if a bank cannot find other ways to meet the shortage. But we also mentioned in class this is the most expensive way because it has many costs associated with it. So unless there's really emergency, a bank is unwilling to adopt this 4th way. And now the question is about the first way to make up the shortfall. So we talk about the first way is the interest. The cost of the borrowing from other banks through the federal funds market is simply the interest paid on the borrowed funds. So that means we can simply multiply this shortage because the bank needs to borrow $4.55 million, multiply this shortage amount by the federal funds interest rate, 0.25%. So the cost, simply this times 0.25. And the cost here, because it's a cost, so we need to put this as a positive number. And here you can see the unit is no longer in million dollars. So we need to put this into dollars rather than million dollars by multiplying by million. So this gives us, and get rid of this negative sign by putting a negative in front of it. So now we have 11.11375. That's the cost of borrowing from the federal funds market. So nice work.